Gettysburg College is proud to mark one of the most notable events of the Cold War, the 50th anniversary of the visit of the Premier of the Soviet Union to the United States in the summer of 1959. It was an era of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, and since the satellite, Sputnik, had riveted everybody's attention, the tensions had gotten worse. The United States was concerned about its ability to maintain its supremacy over the Soviet Union in terms of its nuclear warheads. The Soviets were determined to catch up and, if possible, exceed the United States in its throw weight and its ability to fire weapons. That was pretty big stuff. In addition to that, there was a growing problem in Germany. Premier Khrushchev was making remarks that suggested he would oust the American and British and French troops in Western Berlin by force if necessary. The United States, of course, was determined to hold fast in that. So there were issues at stake. They were substantial and they were important. President Eisenhower thought he could make a breakthrough by inviting Premier Khrushchev to the United States for personal conversation, and Khrushchev leapt at the opportunity. There was a lot at stake in the meeting in Gettysburg between these two world leaders. We'll be discussing aspects of the meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev, and with Dwight Eisenhower's granddaughter, Susan Eisenhower. Well, I'd like to begin our conversation with you, Sergei Khrushchev. I'd like to get a sense from you about your perception and your dad's perception in 1959 about the world situation, just before the invitation from Dwight Eisenhower came to visit the United States.
It was changing from war to peace, because Stalin's idea was that war inevitable, and country have to be prepared for the war. And it was enough ground about this, because it was endless discussion in the Congress how many Russian cities have to be destroyed. It depends how many nuclear bombs Americans have. At 25, that means 20. And then when Stalin died, both sides face the same question. What we can do with the opposite side? And it was turning point in Geneva, where my father was meeting with the Western leaders and sitting next to the President Eisenhower. And he came from there with the conclusion, we can prevent the war. We can deal with that people, but we have to be strong. And he proclaimed two ideas. First is peace coexistence, that we cannot we can discuss which system is better, but we have to live together because we are living on the same planet. And secondly, he dropped all these communist dogma in 1956. We know 56, the secret speech, so-called secret speech about Stalin, but it was even more important in his report. He told that still the revolution is not inevitable, that we mustn't planning fighting the capitalism. We cannot say that we will discuss only with people that agree with us. We have discussed with people with whom you fully disagree, and then influence the opposite side. If you're feeling strong, you're feeling you're right. And it was the beginning of this discussion where both sides have the same feeling. We are right, but we have to find how we'll live together on this planet. And my father had a great respect to the President Eisenhower, and he was proud that he will visit United States, because it was, of course, the powerful country in the world. And he was the first Russian leader from Imperial Russia, from the Soviet Russia, who visited that country. For him, it was like discovery of America.
You know, that's a very interesting analysis of how your father perceived the world. But if you look at it from the United States side, your father also said, rather famously, "We shall bury you." And a lot of people didn't take that as an economic interpretation, but as something more scary. And I can say that in general, as someone from that era, I'm old enough to remember Premier Khrushchev, that we feared the Soviet Union, and that the Sputnik satellite made a lot of Americans nervous about a potential escalation of the arms race and Soviet advances in the arms race. So what you're telling me is that your father had very good intentions of peaceful coexistence, but he was moving into a country, visiting a country that was nervous about relations with the Soviet Union, to put it mildly.
You know, when we're talking about we will bury you, he never told this in this context. It was creation of the American propaganda. What he told, he just quoting Karl Marx when they told that capitalism would die, it will bury capitalism. It was very common in the Soviet and the communist world. So it's not insulting, it's not threatening, and just if you're saying America is a democracy, it's very similar. And he told just in this way. And it is another thing, when the president offered the open sky idea in the Geneva, it was the fear on the Soviet side and my father, because he told that if they overfly us, it will be the same as Stalin allowed Hitler to overfly our territory. They will discover how weak we are, and it will provoke America for the strike. So, if we will not strong, that we can show our strengths, we have to just bluffing and saying America that we are so strong and threatening them. So his policy was threatening because we were weak.
Now, Susan Eisenhower, you were either a first or a second grader when Premier Khrushchev was coming to the United States. Tell us a little bit about what your father or grandfather might have said about this coming visit, and whether it was an important deal for the Eisenhower family.
Well, first of all, I was in elementary school here at Kefauver Elementary off of Baltimore Street in Gettysburg, and there was a lot of excitement about the Premier's visit, but I have to say that I don't think it was at all clear that he was going to be coming to Gettysburg. My grandfather had this habit of calling up my mother from time to time and saying, get the kids cleaned up and over to the farmhouse in half an hour or an hour or something. Not an easy thing to do with 4 children largely the same age. So she rounded us all up and got us cleaned up, and we went over, and then, you know, we were in a state of high excitement, because we had heard about this visit, and it was very clear that, that Khrushchev was coming. Then there was a tremendous amount of excitement afterwards, because the press had found out that Khrushchev had been to the farm. And then the next thing was managing us children, because we had to go to school, and I think my parents were quite worried that we would be giving interviews, you know, from the school, from the school steps, and weren't quite sure what we'd be saying. So we had a little bit of a lecture after this visit to not to answer reporters' questions, and, you know, now what would you say if you were asked, and that sort of thing, because it really was a very exciting moment, and we were fully aware of that.
I have to ask, Susan is right, the Gettysburg visit wasn't really part of the regular itinerary, and things were getting a little bit tense and bogging down in some of the discussions in Washington, and the president thought that getting the two of them together in Gettysburg might sort of relieve some tension and make things better. I wanted to ask you, Sergei Khrushchev, did you come into that meeting? Did you come to the farm? And if you did, what did you notice about the farm?
No, I didn't come. They didn't take us to the Camp David, so we was out. But my father behaved with the same as the president. He also can call my mother, told him, we are just leaving Moscow, we'll be in the country house in half an hour, and I have another dozen people with me, so be ready. So we were ready, but we were in Washington, D.C., and I used that time for trying to chase butterflies.
Today we're very used to the fact that heads of state go off to somebody's ranch. This has been happening, I remember since at the time of the Gorbachev meetings. Here in the United States, Ronald Reagan would take him somewhere informally. This was very unusual in the 1950s, and deploying the grandchildren was really part of a larger plan to humanize, actually, this family to the Khrushchev family. And personally, I was really charmed by Khrushchev's farewell message to the American people, singling out the grandchildren as something he remembered from the trip. Also, Eisenhower knew the Russians because of our alliance during World War II, and anybody who does know that part of the world knows that children and families are immensely important. And this is something that we forget in this country today. This was a landmark trip, simply for the combination of openness and the amount of miles traveled, and this informality that was inserted into the process, something very new for its time. I'd like to add that part of the piece of the puzzle here is public opinion in both countries. One of the features of the Cold War, of course, was the propaganda on both sides that went with it. But the public was really not only frightened, but in many ways very hardened to new ideas about how to approach the other side. So actually, over the course of this period as it unfolded, both men took their own internal political hits for expressing, the attitude that there was a different way of looking at this issue. And I think that it's important today. It's hard to explain the Cold War to young people who didn't live through that period, but public opinion and the politics of the Cold War made the room to maneuver very difficult.
I get the strong impression, though, in reading about Eisenhower that the events of May and June of 1960 were profoundly dispiriting to him. Khrushchev had scored some kind of a propaganda advantage, and yet I'm wondering, Sergei Khrushchev, whether in the end he was pretty sad about this development as well, the breakdown of the possibility of the four-way summit and all of that.
He being who, sorry?
Khrushchev.
No, because,
he was not.
No, because, I will repeat, he and the Soviet Union have to be recognized as equal. And for him, the flight as itself, it was not important as the spying. For him it was important that it was insulting the Soviet Union. And then most insulting was the State Department statement that they will overfly Soviet territory. Still difficult to explain because it was after President banned all the flights. And it was another insult that you are sitting there, we will do this. So he really was trapped, because you have the hardliners that want just to stop all these relations. And from the other, he himself was in the position, as he told that he was very honest, that I cannot negotiate with the American president if he will not say something. And he sent the message from the Czech embassy on the May 9, when he met privately with Ambassador Thompson and told, I want to resolve this crisis in this or other way. And he flew day before to Washington, thinking that maybe Americans will agree to meet. He didn't need or expect official apology. The president will say, oh, I am wrong. He understood he will not do this. But if a meeting is sitting in front of each other, talking, and then we went that door, I told, this question out of table, we resolve it, he will be satisfied. So it's very complicated relations between two personalities, between two countries.
It's a very compelling interpretation. The one element that goes slightly off grain of what I have read in the standard literature is that Khrushchev was insulted primarily because Eisenhower publicly accepted responsibility, and he felt that that was inappropriate, that the president, that was itself an insult, that the President of the United States would have authorized those overflights of the Soviet Union.
No.
Well, I'd like to say a couple of points. If you look at this from 30,000 feet, first of all, at the Geneva summit, President Eisenhower proposed an open skies idea. And you could argue that the U-2, from an American perspective, was unilateral open skies. Eisenhower felt, first of all, I think he was deeply regretful that it caused the crisis it did. But he was fighting his own military-industrial complex and used the U-2 as much for domestic purposes as for foreign policy purposes. In understanding the situation, in the Soviet Union, it enabled him to say no to military forces that wanted a rapid and increasing buildup. We had during this period the bomber gap, the missile gap, all of this political pressure to try and make the case that Dwight Eisenhower was not protecting the national security of this country. And so I think this is what makes the story so painful and regrettable. At the end of the day, Eisenhower accepted responsibility for this and probably hated the impact it would have on the Soviet premier, but felt very strongly that it was important for the Soviets and everyone else to understand that the President of the United States was the President of the United States and that he knows what goes on in his own government. To leave the impression that there are rogue forces in the U.S. government that the President has no knowledge of would be far worse for his own credibility, even with the Soviet Union over time, than admitting this mistake. At the end of the day, I think these were two men who understood the horrors of war and actually thought in very similar terms, in a way, about the unwinnability of a nuclear war and the importance of getting along in this world because so much was at stake.
I would add that I would not agree that Khrushchev was insulted that the president took this responsibility. He told that he missed opportunity just to take a side.
Yeah.
But from my father's perspective, the same. If you are the leader, you have to take responsibility for everything, no difference you authorize this deal or not, because it's part of the thing. He was insulted by the State Department statement. It was that we will overfly, because authorization is one thing. I authorized, but we have to just calm it down and let's go forward. But if you are saying, I will do it in the future, it was very different. So we have to bring together State Department and the President.
It's clear that this was an important episode in Cold War history, and it's one that we will continue to be discussing over a long period of time. I'd like to thank Susan Eisenhower and Sergei Khrushchev for coming in here to the Eisenhower Institute to discuss this important piece of American history and Soviet history, and we look forward to your further conversation on the subject. Thank you very much.